There's always a lot of noise when you're 3-10. I understand that. Every organization has it. There's going to be a lot more noise over the next 3 weeks. I understand that. But I got one mindset right now, and that's focusing on Atlanta. We're going against a football team that was 13-3 last year. They're 3-10 as well. As I share with our football team, they know that they're going to get my best shot over the next 3 games, and I'm hoping I get their best shot over the next three games. Our goal is to win the next 3, and I'm not going to get into relationship. We talked about Robert. You asked me my relationship with Robert, and I said I was his coach, his head football coach, and not necessarily his best friend. Don't need to be his best friend. I want to make him the best quarterback possible. And, we can get through relationships and those type of things. But at the end of the day, my job is to get this football team ready to play Atlanta. I know we played very poorly against Kansas City. Did a poor job getting them ready. Hopefully a much better job this week. There's always going to be rumors. There's going to be partial truths in everything that comes out there. Someone will take some, In fact, when I read it, it talked about me cleaning out my office. It'd take me 2 minutes to clean out my office. I got 2 notebooks, and I've got an iPad. That would get me out of my office. So when I hear different things like that, I just shake my head. So that's as far as I'm going to go with that.
Back on This Week in Football, presented by Geico, a downright disappointing season in D.C. has now turned ugly for the Redskins, the latest wrinkle before the latest loss. A report that Mike Shanahan had actually thought about quitting after last season over the relationship between quarterback Robert Griffin III and owner Dan Snyder. I mean, we can see from Mike Shanahan's tone, Gary, that he is not totally denying the reports that are out there. He's saying, well, there are partial truths with everything, and it's gotten ugly. It's been an unbelievably poor season, but now it's gotten ugly. So do you think it's over for Mike Shanahan in Washington?
I mean, as we're sitting here today, Ryan, with 3 games to go in the season, I'd say I'd be surprised if Mike Shanahan was the coach of the Redskins next year. I think too much has happened, too much has been said, and then you throw on top of that, they win the NFC East last year, and now to be 3-10. Dan Snyder has been known to change coaches, and I would anticipate that he'll change coaches after the season.
Is it reasonable? I mean, is it even remotely reasonable for a head coach to be that upset that he'd want to quit over the relationship between his star player, who, by the way, has finally brought some respectability back to this head coach last year with what he did with the 7 straight wins, and the owner? I mean, is that a reasonable tack for the head coach to have?
Well, I think you have to remember, the head coach has to be the head coach of the entire team. He can't be the head coach of 52 players and have the franchise quarterback only report or be concerned about how the owner feels. And that's certainly, what you're hearing out of Washington is that, Dan Snyder and RG3 have this really tight relationship. And I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with an owner, having a nice relationship with some of his players. But if the perception was that he just kind of picked out RG3 because he's the star quarterback and did things for him he wasn't doing for other players, and if RG3 felt he was only answering to the owner and not to the head coach, I don't think that's a healthy situation.
Well, I mean, the real twist to all this is RG3 is now a shell of himself, in large part because of the decisions that Mike Shanahan made with him last year, though.
Well, still, I think Mike Shanahan is an excellent coach. He won 2 Super Bowls, but the decision he made in the Seattle game, the playoff game, was the worst coaching decision I think I've ever made when it came to the respect of a player's health. I mean, I was at that game on the second series. RG3 hurt his knee, running to his right, fell down out of bounds. You don't need a doctor to tell you. You don't need the player to tell you that he's just not the same after you see him run after that. And, he went down again in the 4th quarter and, wound up with a torn ACL. I don't understand what Shanahan was thinking. They had a 14-0 lead at that point. Why he kept him in the game when he clearly was physically compromised. I just don't get it.
Well, nor did I, nor did anyone. It was one of the more mind-boggling decisions we've ever seen. So let me ask you something a little bit more nefarious, okay? Based on what we were just hearing, that report about he cleaned out his office and he had wanted to quit even before the playoff game because of that relationship. You think there's any chance that he coached that game without proper care for Robert Griffin III because he was upset with him over his relationship with Dan Snyder?
Well, I'd really like to believe that wasn't true. That I have a hard time believing that one. I think Mike Shanahan is a good man, and I don't think he put his player at risk because he was upset with the relationship that he had with the owner. That would be unbelievable.
Now, even Shanahan here, he obviously is not coming off as pristine in this entire situation, right. But a lot of head coaches have had trouble with Dan Snyder. This is not exclusive to Mike Shanahan. Dan Snyder has been a difficult owner to work for. So when you just think about a breakdown in dynamic here with Washington Redskins, do you put it more on Snyder or more on Shanahan?
Well, I think if they were winning, that the relationship would be fine. The fact that they're losing and Snyder and Shanahan each have very strong personalities, I think you can probably put it on both of them, because Snyder is not an easy guy to work for. I mean, look at how many head coaches he's had. But I just want to give you a little background. Snyder bought the team in 1999. After that season, he went to the Pro Bowl where he met Mike Shanahan. He and Shanahan had dinner, they had drinks a couple nights, whatever, and they became pretty close friends. So within the ensuing years, when they would go to league meetings, Shanahan and Snyder would sit next to each other, often, even though, Shanahan was working for the Broncos and Snyder owned the Redskins. Then, Shanahan gets fired by the Broncos. A year later, Snyder fires Jim Zorn, and he approaches Mike Shanahan and offers him the job. Shanahan gets on the phone with Joe Gibbs, who is Dan Snyder's all-time favorite coach. He idolized him growing up in Washington, then, convinced him to retirement. So Shanahan has a 90-minute conversation with Gibbs to get background on working for Snyder, and obviously Gibbs gave him a high recommendation because Gibbs does like Snyder very much, and Shanahan takes a 5-year contract or signs a 5-year contract for $35 million. Now, for $7 million a year, you can probably put up with anybody.
Yeah,
right?
I would say sometimes you could deal with a not-so-great boss in this situation.
But it has now deteriorated to the point where there's a lot of rumors out there that Shanahan wants to get fired, or he wants to make an easy exit out of there and perhaps, wind up being the head coach of the Houston Texans. We'll see how that plays out.
Do you think this is a desirable job?
I do. First of all, it's one of only 32 jobs. So if you can get one of them, you take it. The second thing is, it is the Redskins. It's a flagship franchise in the league. And the one thing you can always say about Dan Snyder, Ryan, is that he does want to win. Sometimes he goes about it in weird ways. He doesn't have a lot of patience. They pay a lot of money to players that they shouldn't, like Albert Haynesworth a few years ago. They got themselves in salary cap trouble where they lost a lot of money like the Cowboys did, taking off their cap. But I think ultimately this guy wants to win more than anything. And I do think if Shanahan is not the coach there next year, that there will be people lining up for that job.
Well, those people would be looking at a very high draft pick. Right now, the Redskins will be slated to pick second. Of course, that pick is headed to St. Louis, thanks to the RG3 trade.